I am standing now in the lobby of JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, right outside of their world-famous Jewish library, the largest Jewish library in the Western Hemisphere, rivaled only by the National Library in Israel. And I am standing now next to Sharon Mintz, the curator of
Jewish art
for the library. I am so excited to show you the incredible treasures inside. Come on in. Our series, Show and Tell, will take you inside some of the great libraries, both public and private, to explore books and treasures from Jewish history. This is the gorgeous lobby of the JTS Library. And tell us, Sharon, what are we looking at? This is gorgeous.
Thank you very much. We are looking at the new exhibition space in the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary, whose new building was just opened in the last year. But actually, the history of the JTS Library goes back quite a bit further. The library itself was founded with the beginning and the foundation and the establishment of the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1886. The library grew and flourished and bought collections en bloc throughout the first part of the 20th century. It didn't just buy 2 or 3 Haggadot, it bought 2,000. It didn't just buy 1 or 2 incunables, it would buy 10 or 20 at a time. Whole collections came here primarily from European collectors and thereby were saved from the ashes of the Holocaust.
What exactly is this exhibit that we're looking at? I mean, it's so gorgeous what you've done with the walls, it's beautiful.
Thank you. This is
tell us about the exhibit.
Second exhibition that we have here in the library in our new building. We've had exhibitions for the last century. Many people don't know actually that the Jewish Museum also is part of the Jewish Theological Seminary. So the main exhibition branch is the Jewish Museum. But here at the library, it's our mandate to share Judaica treasures with the public. And what we do is we try to pick little out-of-the-way things that people might not know as much about and showcase the library treasures. In this particular exhibition, we joined together with Michelle Margolis, who is the head of Judaica and Hebraica at Columbia University Library.
Past guests, check out her video, she's #1.
Michelle's amazing. She came to me 5 years ago and said, Sharon, you have an incredible collection of material from Corfu, and the Columbia University Library has a similarly important collection. Let's get together and let's do a joint exhibition. And I thought, that's a wonderful idea. People don't know where Corfu is. They don't know how important the Jewish communities were there. And so we put together this exhibition. Corfu is an Ionian island between the Adriatic and the Ionian Seas. It's off the coast of Greece. The most interesting thing to know about Corfu is that it was under Venetian rule for 4 centuries. For 400 years, from 1386 until 1797, Corfu was actually part of Venice. Here you see Venice up here, and you see Corfu down here. And Corfu decided that they wanted to be a protectorate of Venice. They actually enjoyed that role, and Venice came and protected them when the Ottoman Empire tried to besiege Corfu, which happened on 3 major occasions, and you can see one of those occasions right here.
What are we looking at here? This is such a gorgeous, where is this from? It's obviously made bigger.
This is from an atlas, and the atlas was printed in 1575, and it's cityscapes of all the main cities. It's printed in 6 volumes. This is from volume 2. The Jewish community is approximately over here.
Beautiful.
It's not a large island.
And what are some of the treasures, just broad strokes? What are some of the treasures you have from Jewish life in Corfu? These look like ksubot.
They are. What you're looking at are a series of decorated ktubot. And the ktubot have a very interesting scheme of decoration and illustration. They have the signs of the Zodiac. They have coats of arms of the families. And they have biblical scenes. You can see the signs of the Zodiac most clearly on this ketubah from 1820. The reason, do you know why there's signs of the Zodiac on Ketubot?
I have no idea. I wish I had one on mine.
So,
I don't look at anything like this.
It's a very interesting pattern of decoration. And the reason is, at the top of every ketubah it says, B'simana Tava, right? Siman Tov and Mazel Tov in Aramaic over there. And the Hebrew word for zodiac is mazal.
Mazal.
Exactly.
Beautiful.
So having the signs of the zodiac on these ketubot literally means it's a visual interpretation of Mazel Tov.
What Mazel Tov is.
Exactly. The stars should align and your marriage should be one of good fame and fortune.
Absolutely beautiful. Make sure on your ksubas, maybe draw them in after, get those zodiac pictures on there. That is absolutely beautiful.
The other thing that I would say about these ketubot is that they very much mimic, or they kind of imitate this decoration of ketubot that you see in Venice. Because Corfu was under Venetian rule during this period, and even when it was under British rule, this is actually 5 years into British rule, they maintained the tradition of the Venetian style of decorating ketubot. Another thing that might interest your viewers is the fact that Corfu has a continuity of manuscript tradition well into the 19th century, at a time when we find that Hebrew books and prayer books are printed and people are davening from printed prayer books. We find that these continue in manuscript form in Corfu.
Handwritten.
Handwritten. You'll see all handwritten in here. And the reason for this is not yet known. Printing does not come to Corfu until 1877.
Wow.
But they're under Venetian rule.
So what?
Venice is a center of Hebrew printing. Why weren't they printing
and shipping them or something?
We don't know. We don't know. They also have wonderful illustrations that you find nowhere else. A series of illustrations of Shimshon Hagibor, Samson, Joshua. This is Abraham and Sarah. This is very unusual to have illustrated prayer books at a time where everybody's using the printed version.
Books. Fascinating.
This exhibition opened up more questions than we actually have answers for.
Fascinating. One of the treasured personalities of the JTS Library, it's not just the books, it's the people who run it. And I am standing now with Dr. David Kraemer, who's the director of JTS's library, who's going to show us some of the amazing treasures here. So what are we looking at over here?
So in addition to our immense collection of Hebrew manuscripts, we've got a very significant, also immense collection of rare Hebrew printed books, including collections from the earliest stages. Here you've got the first printing, the Bamberg, the first printing of the Babylonian Talmud, complete.
Complete from beginning to end. There was
Exactly.
an earlier version that was put out by
Exactly.
Sansino, but he didn't finish the job.
Exactly.
Bamberg
So
finished the job.
1520 to 23.
And the pagination that we have to this day, what's known as the Daf, all comes from Bamberg.
That's right, right. Both the pagination and actually, to a very significant extent, the layout of the page.
Okay.
I mean, if you look at it visually, from edition to edition, it winds up replicating it very carefully.
So why do you have this page open up to us right now? This looks to me, I know a little bit about my way around through Talmud. Mm-hmm. This is from Tractate Sanhedrin. Mm-hmm. This is page 43, what's known as Daf Mem Gimel. Mm-hmm. What is interesting about this page?
Well, there are a number of things that are interesting about it, but there's one thing I want to focus on. Early in print, right, new technology.
Sure.
Right, they began to learn how you could take advantage of the printed page. So you'll notice in our common Gemara, you've got the name of the tractate, you've got not only the page number, but a variety of other things. Look here, right, it labels the chapter, gives us the page, but no name of tractate.
Why do you think that is?
Because they hadn't yet appreciated the full
What you can
possibility
do.
of this technology.
All the possibilities.
It's kind of like early web versus more
Exactly.
recently. But what's really astounding here, the world didn't appreciate the power of the printing press and the danger of the printing press. Because during the manuscript age, how many copies of there of anything, right? Sure. So if you've got a few copies circulating and they say things that the authorities might take issue with, the authorities usually looked aside. Censorship was not a regular part of the manuscript world. When we get to print, and when print begins to make its impact, all of a sudden the church and other authorities realizes, whoa, things that are said about us or which we find objectionable will now have impact not just with a few people, but potentially with hundreds and more. And so they began a regime of censorship, and originally, a print like this, right?
So this is the original.
Bomberg. This is the first.
It's like pasted on. Why is that?
Well, this is a composite edition, right?
Okay.
I mean, in cases where pages were missing, we assembled from various sources, but this winds up being.
This is Tractates on Hedron.
This is
so what do we see over here?
So this is the beginning of the 6th chapter, Nigmar Adin. And if you look at the pages, there's actually nothing outstanding.
It's the same.
Right, page by page. They take advantage of the full page of printing.
Like if you go over
right,
here.
and here's this is my own personal shas. And you can go page by page.
It's the same Tosos, more or less.
Exactly, it's all laid out the same. But on this very same page, Mem Gimel 43a, when we come to the common printed, this is Vilna shas, right? You can see
that's a lot of blank space, unused. They printed it on all the other pages. Right. What was missing here?
Look over here before censorship, and we find tradition. This is talking about execution, right? That's the beginning of this chapter. It's how a court would execute. And this is talking about the execution of Jesus and Jesus' disciples. So not only does it record the rabbinic view of that event, of the execution of Jesus and Jesus' disciples, but it actually does, in a very direct way, mock the disciples of Jesus.
So this was taken out by censorship.
So the church censored this, did not permit the reprinting of the Talmud subsequent to this before that section was removed.
Wow, and I want to tell you something very interesting, a little bit of a spoiler. I knew about this because my grandfather, Rabbi Moshe Bekritsky, he was a student of Rav David Leibovitz, who started Yeshivas Chafetz Chaim. And when I was young, 5th, 6th grade, he took me aside and he showed me this very page. And he didn't have a Bomberg shas. He didn't have the same budget as the JTS Library, but he had a volume called the Chesronos Hashas, which is everything that was missing, everything that was taken out. And I remember he called me over and he sat me on his lap and he showed me what was missing here. So something very moving to see, not just in the Chesronos Hashas, but the original Bomberg, that piece that's missing.
What's interesting is that this was left out of all subsequent printings of Shas until contemporary Israel, right, where there's no longer concern for censorship. There have been editions of Shas that have been reprinted now with this section restored.
Even in the actual...
Exactly.
Fascinating. We're now joined both by Dr. David Kraemer and Sharon Mintz, who really are at the center of this amazing library and all these treasures. And there's so much history here. The library was founded what year?
In 1886.
In 1886. And then...
It grew over the course of the next half century and amassed numerous important collections, including the Cairo Geniza. And in 1966, tragedy struck the library. The library was housed in a tall tower right where you walk into the building. And the fire there was consumed some of the books, but the actual problem was that they threw water down from the top of this building because there were no windows on the side. Now there are windows. If you come to JTS, you'll see them. But it had what was known as a blind facade. So the only way to put the fire out was to take water from the top. And as the water filtered down through the floors, and the floors were open grates in order to promote air circulation, which was the way you built things in 1929, it damaged the books.
Old libraries were designed.
Yes, many old libraries were designed that way.
Go from stack to stack, but it was wide open.
Wide open. At that point, what they decided to do was they needed to bring in volunteers to help dry the books. And they brought up all the paper towels in the tri-state area, kind of literally. And they had hundreds of volunteers who came down and actually interleaved the books. They would put paper towels in between each page and press it tight and then take it out and do it again until the book was dry. And we know that volunteers came from the yeshivot, from Yeshiva University, from the universities, who literally closed their classes in April of 1966 to bring in the manpower and help save the cultural patrimony of the Jewish people.
And where were all these books drying off?
So it was in a courtyard. JTS was built as many academic institutions with 3 buildings around a large courtyard, and they put it out there, and you can see people with the books open, kind of trying to dry it out, and it actually saved the books. Since that time, they now know that you can freeze dry books. They do this when they're ever flooded, and that sucks out the moisture in a more effective, faster way. But that hadn't been discovered just yet.
My wife's going to kill me when I start leaving books in our freezer. That's the next
It's not that kind of freeze drying.
She's
going
to open up the fridge. Open up the fridge. It's just books.
It's very important to emphasize
Yeah.
that this entire story relates not to our rare collection, which is what we've been discussing and showing, but to our general collection. Right? So the tower was the stacks
the
of
real
our general
rare treasures
collection.
are
The
still
rare
intact.
treasures, the rare book room of that time was not in the tower. It was in a different section of JTS. And what that means is that as tragic as this was, and it was, and to be fair, there are materials that were in the stacks in those days that we would long since have considered to be rare, but our actual rare book room and the materials, many of which you see around us, or which we've been showing you, were in a different location. And so, thank God, while this affected that general collection, and there were many very important things in that collection, some of them irreplaceable because they're prints that had been made and were no longer available. Nevertheless, this did not affect our rare collections.
One thing that's amazing about JTS is that the library preserves the history in these really charming sign-in books. This is titled over here, the Mortimer and Harriet Marcus Rare Bookroom Visitors Book. So you can really see the history is told of who came to visit, and you actually have the documents of like who came to dry the books. Exactly. And they were coming in, and they were all out in that lobby kind of soaking and making sure that they would dry up and be preserved. Is there a particular book you know that was lost, or that is no longer part of the collection, that couldn't be saved, that you still think about?
Well, the great father of bibliography, Steinschneider's collection, was in the general stacks, and his own personal annotated collection was most primarily lost to the fire. The Benayim manuscript collection was being processed. So this was books that were being processed were in this area as well. So there are things that we know were lost.
Or that were affected and damaged.
Yeah, water damage.
But it's a moving story about New York Jewry coming together to save our collective history.
I mean, there were unhappy accidents. The last collection that Sharon just mentioned had been recently retrieved from North Africa by our librarian of the time, Menachem Schmelzer.
He traveled to gather that collection, and it had not yet been processed. And so it was caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Having said that, the library building before this one had a huge high-density storage room. And in that room, amongst other things, were thousands, right? I think that's fair to say, right? Tens of thousands of materials that survived the fire. And sat there for decades, and we struggled but ultimately succeeded to raise money to process a lot of that collection, and we have recovered books, and some of them which, again, before the fire were not yet deemed to be rare, we now recognize their rarity, and they've been added to our rare collections since. In the period of time of just the last few years, our collection of rare printed books has gone from about 25,000 to about 32,000. Well, much of that recovering from those materials. Just give me a ballpark. How many books are there in the JTS library?
Rounding, including all materials, about 400,000.
400,000. Good amount.
It's
a good amount for a library. Good amount for a library. One of the most amazing things that I've always been fascinated with is the Cairo Geniza and the work done by Solomon Schechter to retrieve the Geniza. Tell me a little bit about what made the Cairo Geniza unique, and what is the find that you have over here?
So the Geniza is absolutely unique. Unique not only for collections in the world, but for Genizas. Because two things set it apart. For reasons we don't know, unlike a common Geniza, the material that was thrown into it was not sent forward for burial. It wasn't a temporary holding place. It wound up being a permanent holding place.
Burial, we bury, to explain, meaning
Well,
the stuff that
the
you put
way
in what's so much
Jewish tradition, as you know, preserves sacred materials is by, in some ways, analogizing them to the human body.
To a person.
Right? The same kind of treatment
Sure.
that a
And you
person
bury it in the
deserves in
ground.
order to honor them. Sacred text requires
But this
the same
never
thing.
got buried, and it stuck around.
So this never got buried. It resulted in certain indignities. In the late 19th century, before Salman Schechter got there, the community decided it was time to reconstruct, to renovate the synagogue. And so they took the entire Geniza and just threw it out in the yard. And whatever layering might have been there, and larger documents were thrown together and inevitably became smaller documents into fragments. And whatever layering may have existed before that was totally lost. So it makes this a much larger puzzle.
So what's this piece that we have over here?
But before I do that, this
Okay.
this is, as you'll see, a piece of sacred writing. But the other thing that set the Cairo Geniza apart is the fact that the community seems to have believed, this is the best explanation we can come up with, that anything written in Hebrew characters is sacred
And holy.
by virtue of the Hebrew characters. But the community spoke Arabic. They wrote their Arabic using Hebrew characters. And that means that any kind of document that they wrote, it could be a business document in Arabic. It could be a list, literally shopping lists, lists of books that you might have in your collection, on and on and on. We can create histories from this material, from its hundreds of thousands of pieces that could not be recreated any other way. And this is significant not only for our understanding of the life of Jews in medieval Cairo and beyond, but for the life of Muslims as well, because this is the most complete picture we have of what it meant to live in Cairo during the 11th, 12th, 13th century. Now, amongst the materials, of course, were sacred materials, but of a very particular sort. So let me show you this. It's a stunning piece, as you'll see in a moment. Poor handwriting.
Yeah, I'm trying to make it out. This wasn't as easy as some of the other things that I've seen. I can't make out a word
because
here.
someone's writing quickly, and they happen to be a doctor, right? And we know that doctors don't have such great handwriting, right?
Yes, that is true. I grew up in the home of one.
Interestingly, it actually mismarks the number of the chapter. Right? You can see here it says Perek Shnemasar. Turns out to be chapter 22. All right, chapter 22 of the Mishnah Torah's section dealing Hilchot Malva Velova.
Wow. This is an original.
And this is Maimonides' original composition. This is actually in Maimonides' handwriting, right? This is the Rambam, right? And you can see the Rambam writing his law and then reevaluating its formulation.
Crossing things out.
Filling in between the lines. We've got it right here on both sides. You can see that later on the pages were reused because materials for writing were very, very expensive. Right? But if you were to take this out and compare it to a printed Rambam, you would find that the formulation is very, very close, which is quite remarkable because, of course, manuscripts change from one copy to the other. If things are preserved close, right, there'll always be changes, but if they're preserved in a way that's close to the original writing, that shows that the text is considered to be very sacred.
And this is the handwriting.
This is the actual handwriting of Rambam. And why is it in the Geniza? Why is it waste? We have to assume that after it was formulated, manuscripts were created of the Mishnah Torah, you no longer needed the original copy. Right?
22nd chapter of Hilchos Malva Velova.
Exactly right. Now, how do we know that it's his handwriting? Right? The answer here is because here and in the collection in Cambridge, but this is one clear example, we have got, unmistakably, Maimonides' signature. Right? The letter here, this is a letter, was not written by Rambam, it was written by his scribe, Mevorach ben Natan, but you can see at the end the chief executive officer of the Cairo Jewish community signs his name. Multiple copies would have been made by this. It was written in 1170.
Is this?
Yeah, you can see. Moshe is kind of blotted out, right? I mean, it's, right, but Maimon
And that
Right,
the
so-
Rambam signed at the bottom?
That is his own signature. That's right.
And somebody else copied the top, and then the
right.
Rambam.
And this is a letter which was actually directed to various Jewish communities in the nearby Near East for their payment of funds that had been pledged for the redemption of captives. A couple of years before this, captives had been taken by the Crusader community nearby in Egypt, and this is Pidyon Shvuyim. Right? They needed to be released, and the only way they were going to be released is if the money that was demanded was paid. And Maimonides here steps up and says, we're going to pay our pledges, and you've got to do the same in order to perform this mitzvah.
Do you have any sense of how much original writing from the Rambam exists outside of this library, what we're looking at now?
Well, we preserve materials in a variety of volumes, right? Some of which you can see over there. All of that is material related to the Rambam and his family.
It says Maimonides family, Geniza fragments.
Right, exactly. So that is the bulk of our material, but there's considerable quantity of material in Cambridge as well.
It's like kind of really moving to have been introduced to the Rambam, obviously in a printed Mishnah Torah, and to see it, the very handwriting, that's pretty emotional. It's pretty powerful.
As this is being shot around the beginning of the new year, and people buy calendars sometimes for the new year, people who are still interested in print, or often change their calendar, what I thought would be interesting to show people was the very first known printed Hebrew calendar.
Wow.
And here what you see on a calendar is you have the months, and it gives you other information about what you could expect to find during the year, the holidays.
This was like the original Ezra's Torah Luach.
Yes.
The original, like.
Exactly right, going back to the very end of the 15th century. Hebrew printing began in Rome in 1469, approximately 1469 to 1470. The earliest Hebrew books are not dated, but that's the approximate year which we believe that they were printed. And among the earliest Hebrew books is this 2-volume Machzor.
What year is this from?
And this volume, this is the very first printed Machzor, and it was printed in 1485. And in 1485, they printed this rite, this Roman rite, the Minhag B'nai Roma, which is not Romaniot of the Byzantine community that we were talking about before with Corfu, but it's actually the minhag that the Jews of Rome used in their prayer service. And you see over here the page for Hoshana, for Hoshanos.
Beautiful.
Right? And this book was printed by the Soncino family of Hebrew printers.
Soncino.
Exactly.
We know the name Soncino. That's a brand name.
The brand name was taken from one of the most important and earliest families of Hebrew printing. They first began printing in 1483 in the town of Soncino, from whence they took their name. And the first book that they printed was a Gemara, Brachot. And after that, they moved to various different cities in Italy. And this 2-volume Machzor is actually testimony to that, because half of it was printed in the town of Soncino, and the other half was printed in the town of Casale Maggiore.
I noticed that you're pronouncing it Soncino.
I know, that's the correct Italian name.
And not Soncino.
Yeah.
Soncino is the
Soncino is the Americanized way of doing it.
Soncino.
Yes.
Soncino.
Soncino. Exactly. I think I've got my accent wrong, so I was just going to get some weights. Yeah, okay. These are known as snakes, and they're weights that libraries use to hold down the book. But it's.
Where do you buy snakes? On Amazon?
You probably can. What can't you buy on Amazon? There's a store called Talus, which sells materials for conservation.
For conservation.
Any kind of conservation.
Is that where they sell these little book pillows?
Yes.
I love these. I want to sleep with these under my head. They're so soft. They're absolutely lovely.
Yeah, that's correct. All right. So here what you see is a Haggadah. And the word matzah is in a decoration here. The Soncino family of printers printed many, many books throughout Italy and eventually end up in Constantinople, where the last of that family is printing in the 1530s. But they were very interested in making beautiful books. So not only is their print beautiful, but they also hired artists to create woodcuts that would decorate the books. And you see that throughout their Machzorim. The Talmuds are decorated with beautiful initial letters, initial words. This is the opening to Pirkei Avot over here, Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai. There's a lot to be said about this particular book, but the fact that it's the first printed Machzor.
This is the first printed Machzor, absolutely beautiful.
What you're looking at here is a manuscript Siddur. And it's an unusual thing because with the advent of printing, Hebrew manuscript production decreases. Most people would prefer to buy 5 printed books or 10 printed books rather than spend the money
on one handwritten manuscript.
Manuscript tradition doesn't completely peter out. We have calendars that are done, Sifrei Vernot. We have Kabbalistic works, people writing their own books. But for the most part, once printing begins in 1469, 1470, that was the unusual phenomenon about Corfu, that in fact we still have the continuity of manuscript tradition. What you see over here is a very interesting phenomenon. In the early 18th century, there were a group of Jews known as court Jews. And these court Jews were very, very wealthy financiers to all of the various principalities throughout what's known as the Habsburg Empire. Vienna, Frankfurt, all of the various cities in Ashkenaz, where there were wealthy rulers who needed bankers, basically, to support what they were doing. So these Jews were very wealthy, and what they did was they created a renaissance of illustrated and decorated Hebrew manuscripts. Because at this point, you could buy a printed prayer book. So if you wanted to do something wonderful, you would create a manuscript and you would give it as a gift. And we find...
It had to really distinguish itself because print already exists. So
Exactly,
these manuscripts
exactly.
are very artistic, very colorful.
Exactly that. So this is the very first one of this revival of Hebrew manuscripts. This is dated 1712 to 1714. It was written over a period of 2 years.
And this is all hand...
And this is all hand done. Now, at this time, this was written in Vienna, at this time, the Jews weren't allowed to have public synagogues. So the synagogues were probably in the home of the court Jew. And therefore, this might have been the Chazan's prayer book to daven from, which is why it's so large. Most of these 18th century manuscripts are miniature books. Many of them are Seder Brachot that were given from the groom to the bride, to his bride-to-be. And they're books of blessings, mitzvot nashim, etc.
There's so many libraries in the world. What's special about the JTS Library?
What's really electrifying about this library is how much of Jewish history it encompasses. We have books from the last 1,000 years from every single part of the Jewish world, from Yemen, from the Balkans, from Italy, from Ashkenaz, from North Africa, from Syria, from Lebanon. There's no aspect of Jewish history and culture which is not represented here. And earlier you had asked me, what's the most interesting thing? We keep finding more things all the time. There's not a moment that we don't look through the stacks and say, gee, that's absolutely fantastic. And what we're trying to do is digitize as much as we can to make it available to people around the world. But also, scholars and interested lay people are invited to come in, make an appointment. You can use the rare book room. You can handle these things yourselves carefully. And I find that holding a piece of history from the 15th, 16th, 17th century, whether it's an illustrated Haggadah, whether it's a Pinchas written by a woman, whether it's a decorated Megillat Esther, whether it's the last ketubah in Corfu that was created for a wedding 2 weeks before the Nazis annihilated the entire Jewish community. There's something very electrifying about having all of this material and being able to share it with the public.
What an amazing day spent at this library filled with treasures from all corners of the earth, from all times. of history, the Jewish people, all coming together and their ideas alive and being preserved in the JTS Library. What an absolute pleasure and privilege to spend the day with you and all these incredible treasures at the JTS Library.
Thank you so much for coming. It was our pleasure.